Hi everyone, my name is Zach, and in this video I show you how I created this Hydra sculpting in Blender. This sculpting was created for Sculpt January 2017. If you want to learn more about this event and how you can participate, just click here or the link in the video description. The whole creation process of this image took me about 8 hours, 5 hours sculpting and 3 hours texturing, shading and rendering. Very important, this image was inspired by an artwork I found online on the website artoffantasy.org, but sadly I just found this weird username Zekovsk08, so I don't know the real name of the creator. Yeah, and if you check out the source URL, which is displayed here, it just shows this, I mean, it looks not really like an artist portfolio. Anyway, great design. If you know the real name of the author and maybe have a functional link to his portfolio, let me know in the comments below. So in this video I try something new because I don't want to show you just the whole time lapse. I show you a compressed time lapse of the sculpting part, so I throw out all the boring parts. And additionally I added some tutorial parts where I show you some of the tricks I used more in detail. So I hope that the learning factor from this kind of video is better or higher than just a time lapse. Also at the end of the video we will take a look on how I created the materials and the scene setup, and as a small bonus at the end we will check out how this whole scene looks inside Blender 2.8 EEVEE, so definitely watch till the end of this video. Before we start, don't forget to download my free Blender sculpting cheat sheet, which contains all the important shortcuts for Blender Sculpt Mode. Just click here or the link in the video description. And if you want to learn sculpting in Blender or bring your sculpting skills to the next level, definitely check out my latest video training, Mastering Sculpting in Blender. Alright guys, without further blah blah, let's finally get started. So let's start with the default cube, add a subdivision surface modifier so we have a smooth surface, then add some loop cuts and so on to create a base shape for the upper head. Then I duplicated this in object mode and put it below the upper head to have the jawbone, so we have two separate objects. Then with a simple curve I can easily create the body of this creature. So from this very early stage on here, I adjusted the camera position, the resolution, and also the focal length to get an idea of my final camera perspective, because I know from the start on that I only wanted to create one image from this Hydra, and this should be from this particular camera angle. And as you can see from this angle, I can easily adjust the curve for the body so that everything is in place. Now let's take a look on how to create this curve here. So hit Shift A, add a path, and with Tab switch over to edit mode. And now we have this 5 vertices we can move around to define the shape of our curve. So this thing here, which looks like a spine, is our actual curve. And when you select the first or the last dot, you can press E to extend this even more. Or you select more vertices, press W and hit subdivide. Then a new vertex will be added in between. Now to make a 3D object out of this, switch over to object mode, go to the curve settings, and first of all under geometry, I increase the bevel depth. But now you can see this is only 1/2 of the object. So we have to go to shape, fill, and switch the fill mode to full. Now you can see we have this square shaped cable thing here. So let's increase the resolution to, let's say 6. I think that's alright. And now you can easily adjust this. Switch over to edit mode, select everything, and with Alt S you can scale the whole thing here. And you can also scale individual vertices. For example, let's scale this one here to 0, enter. And then we have this pointy tip here. You can also press N and here change the radius. It's the same thing as if you press Alt S. And now, as you can see, you can easily adjust the curve. And this way I was able to create the body of this Hydra. Also, one trick I will use later in this video, when I add a second curve like this circle here and adjust the shape a bit, however you want it. This new shape here we can use as cross section for this curve here. So let's select this, go to bevel object and choose this. Now let's scale this down. You can see by scaling this thing down here, I can scale this, or I switch over to edit mode, and with Alt S I can also scale it down. And now you can see this object here has the same shape as this one here. And certainly you can always change this if you like. And the very last thing you have to do in order to sculpt on this, you have to press Alt C for convert to, and then choose mesh from curve meta surf text. And then it's a mesh object, and certainly you can sculpt on this. Alright, let's start with the sculpting part of the upper head. Here I applied the subsurf modifier and switched over to Sculpt Mode. And for the first steps, I just tried to somehow get the shape of the upper head right. I pulled out these horns and scales just to get an idea of the upper head. And I realized that this isn't that easy because these dragon heads are really detailed and you just have to figure out what are the important parts and what you should sculpt first before you get too much into the details. So yeah, over the time you will see that I also deleted stuff and started again with certain parts of the head. By the way, it's super easy to pull out geometry. Just use a snake hook brush, enable dynamic topology, constant detail, check the resolution and increase this a bit. And let's disable X mirror. And then we can easily pull this out, as you can see. And in this way, I also created all the larger scales, the ears and stuff like this. And if you set the curve to a more pointy curve, you can also easily make this more pointy or create an interesting shape. If you want to sharpen the edges a bit, just use a crease brush and hold down Control to invert this brush. With a smooth brush, you can clean up the upper area here. Alright, let's go on with the head here. As you can see, now I delete some stuff and still adjusting the head and the shape, because at this point I wasn't really satisfied with the shape so far. And yeah, also the eye I changed multiple times, and I started to add some more sharp edges with the inverted crease brush, and also just some very basic shapes, as you can see. So then I switched over to the jawbone and applied the modifier and started to define the major shapes here as well. And yeah, as you can see, I use the same tricks as for the upper head. Just pull out some geometry, sharpen the edges, and with the snake hook brush or the grab brush, just move the shape around. And for the final shot, I want to have a wide open mouth. So here I rotated the jawbone a bit. If you want to quickly change the rotation of an object, but don't want to use the center point of the object, you can switch down here the pivot point to 3D cursor, then click the 3D cursor to the position you want to rotate around and press R for rotation. And in this way, it's super easy to change the rotation of this jawbone, for example, although the center point is down here. But take care, this only works from one position. You see, it's not in the center of the object, it's over here on the side. So you have to look on the object from the side. Now I switched the outliner in the top right corner to the 3D view and the camera perspective. In this way, it was really great to always see the final camera perspective and see how the overall image is changing over the time. Yeah, now I also do some additional tweaking here and there of the more rough shapes, as you can see. But after I was done with that, I switched over to the next detail level. That means I increased the resolution of the dynamic topology and started to polish the shape a bit. That means I smoothed the surface, I sharpened some edges, and also added details which are not there at this moment. Then here, as you can see, I pulled out this additional skin between the upper head and the jawbone, which was easy to do with a snakehook brush. Now I add a plane, position this under the upper head, and with a mirror modifier and a subsurf modifier, I created this very simple shape for the teeth. Then I duplicated them and changed them a bit so that not every tooth looks the same. It's really important to add non-symmetrical elements to your objects to make it look more realistic. In this case, it was pretty easy to place the teeth on the right position, because if I select the head and down here switch the transform orientation to local, we can see that the orientation of this object is perfectly aligned with the area we want to place the teeth on. So now let's quickly add a new plane. And now I select the plane, then with Shift the head, and up here, when you press N, under Transform Location, right click onto one of those values and then click Copy All to Selected. Now you can see the position of the head was copied over to the plane. The same thing we can do with the rotation, right click, Copy All to Selected. Now you can see the plane has the same rotation as the head. Now let's select this, and now it's super easy to adjust this and to create a teeth out of this here. So if this trick does not work for you because the orientation of the object is not perfectly with the position you want to place the new object with, then definitely check out tip number 14 in my video 17 tips to speed up modeling in Blender. There I show you a cool trick with which you can easily place any object on the surface of other objects. Yeah, then I just duplicated one face of one tooth, added a subsurf modifier and a solidify modifier, and created this additional skin here. Then I duplicated all the teeth from the upper head and placed them in a way that they are more or less fitting to the upper teeth, and then I temporarily changed the rotation of the jawbone. Here's a very simple trick I use if I temporarily want to change the position of an object but want to save the original position so that I can return to the original position later on. So it's super easy. We select the jawbone, for example, go here to frame 1, press I and save location, rotation and scale. Then go to frame 2, change whatever you want to change, press I again, lock road scale again, and now you have saved both positions. Now you can model on this object or sculpt, change something according to the upper head, for example, and then if you are done, then you can easily delete the keyframes. The easiest way is quickly switch over to the dope sheet editor, select all the keyframes, go back to keyframe number 1, press X and delete. Now you have made all the adjustments, but you're now back to the original position. So now I adjust the teeth a bit more so that they are really fitting in between the teeth of the upper head. And then I adjusted the geometry also according to the teeth so that it looks like they are really connected with the head here. Nom, 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 nom. Yeah, and same thing for the upper head. So here I just fine-tune some of the details. So enjoy. So here I just copy and pasted the eye of my Viking sculpting, which I did before that one. If you want to know how I created the eye, just check my Viking sculpting time-lapse. There I also show you how I created the eye in detail. So a Hydra has more than one head, certainly. So I duplicated the head here, but important, I duplicated this with Alt-D. That means they are linked to each other. That means if I do changes later on the head, they will change on all the 3 heads automatically. So yeah, here I just duplicated the curves, changed this over the time, though this was pretty time consuming, so I just fast forward this a bit more. So, and the cool thing here, certainly the heads of the Hydra are looking more or less the same, but it was really easy to add some variation here just by changing how wide the mouth is open and later on the position of the tongues. So this was really easy to do here. So here, as you can see, as shown earlier in the video, I used the trick to add the bevel shape to the curves here to make the whole shape look a little bit more interesting. So here I added a simple plane, extruded this a bit, and in this way I created the base mesh for the tongue here. So super easy to do. I just duplicated this very simple object to the other heads. And as you can see, I changed the tongues. So we have 3 completely different tongues here. And this really sells it that these are 3 different heads. So after I was done with placing all the tongues, I applied the subsurf modifier and started to sculpt on this. Again with dynamic topology. So I added this line with a crease brush on top of the tongue. And I think one thing that really sells that this is a realistic tongue is this connection under the tongue to the jawbone. And yeah, as you can see, with some creases and so on, I added also some details so that this looks a bit more interesting. Yeah, and basically the same thing I also did for the other 2 tongues, just sculpted the details, just like for the first tongue here. Here's a very simple trick if you want to isolate one or more selected objects so that you easily can edit them. Just select it and hit slash on the numpad. Now, as you can see, only the tongue will be displayed, and now I can easily edit this. And if you hit slash on the numpad again, we are back and can see all objects again. If you have no numpad, just go down to View, View Global Local. It's the same thing as you can see. So next step, adjusting the teeth a bit. As you can see, I duplicated some teeth, scaled them smaller and placed them beside the larger teeth. And you can see this somehow adds to the realism that this is a weird creature. Alright, now let's get to the scales. I created this very simple plane shape, added a solidify modifier and a subsurf modifier, applied both, and then I switched over to sculpt mode with dynamic topology on, and yeah, I sculpted some details on the scale here. For now I kept it relatively rough. Later on I will refine the scale a bit. Then here I used the snapping tools to snap the scales to the surface of the creature. As mentioned earlier, if you want to learn how to do that, check out my video 17 tips to speed up modeling in Blender, tip number 14. Link of the video in the video description. So, and from now on it's basically just copy and pasting the scales around. And this certainly took a lot of time. But here one important thing, I used Alt-D to duplicate the scales, so all of those scales are linked to each other. That means if I edit one, all others will be updated automatically. So let's quickly take a look on how this works. Now we have one scale, and you can see we have the object information and the object data. That means in this case, that is the mesh we can edit in edit mode or in sculpt mode. If I now duplicate this thing with Shift D, we can see also the mesh information will be duplicated. That means we have now 2 different meshes saved somewhere in Blender. But if I duplicate this with Alt D and take a look, you can see these 2 objects here are now using the exact same mesh information. We can see it on the exact same name here. So, and as you can see, if I click on that and switch to edit mode, if I edit one, the other one will be edited as well. And the same thing works in sculpt mode. So if I switch to sculpt mode, do some changes here, you can see it will automatically update on the other scale. So, and the cool thing is with Alt and D, I just can duplicate as many scales as I like, but I can still scale them in object mode. So that means if I want to change the size a bit, they are still linked to each other, but with different scales. And as you can see, if I change this here, it will change on all the other objects as well. And this trick also has another cool side effect, because if you are duplicating these objects 1,000 times with a standard ray, the file size of this blend file will be exploding, because one scale here has already 18,000 faces, which is quite a lot. But if we link all the objects, we only have one mesh information instead of thousands, and in this way the file size of this blend file will stay relatively small. And what happens if you accidentally duplicate it with Shift D instead of Alt D? No problem, you can select the ones, then as last you select one of those linked scales, press Ctrl L and make links object data. That means the object data will be linked to this selected objects as well, and as you can see now all of them are using the same mesh again. The other way around, if you want to basically disconnect one object from the whole linked objects, press U and then make single user, object and data. That means if I now edit this one here, only this one object will be affected, and as you can see the mesh information has a different name. Okay, hope this was not too much confusing. Let's go on. So here I took the rough scale and fine-tuned this a bit, so I increased the resolution, sharpened the edges, smoothed the surface a bit, and just added a few details here and there to make this look more appealing. Yeah, and as mentioned before, these changes will automatically apply to all the other scales because all of them are linked to each other. Super cool, huh? I'm a lazy person and I don't want it to copy scales all over the whole body, so I just placed scale around the head, and with the distance I made them smaller and smaller. So it still looked very detailed, but I don't have to create thousands of scales all over the body. And later on when we add the procedural shaders, this all blends very good together. So sadly in Blender you can't sculpt with unlimited details, so I cutted the body of the Hydra in different sections. Certainly I place the cuts where you can't really see it from the camera perspective, and so I can add more details to the sections which are closer to the camera and less details to the sections which are somewhere in the background. So here with some creases I added a few details, and I also added a Displace Modifier to add some scale-like shapes all over the body. Later on this will be a bit stronger, so this really saved me a lot of time. Let's quickly take a look on how to do this. So here we can see the body of this Hydra, and these are actually the details that I sculpted, and with the Displace Modifier on, you can see I added a lot more details, which certainly would take me a while to sculpt all these. But important, you need the subdivided geometry in order to create the details. If we take a look on the back here we have a very low resolution, and there you can see the Displace Modifier will not affect this too much. If you don't have the subdivisions, you can add a subdivision surface modifier first, and after this the Displace Modifier. Then the Displace Modifier will use the subdivisions from the subsurf modifier. Alright, now let's take a look on how we can set this up. Let's delete this. Let's add the Displace Modifier. Let's scale this down. In this case, I use the value 0.03. Now let's create a new texture and switch over to the texture settings. Here we don't want to use an image or movie, we want to use a Voronoi texture. This is a procedural texture which creates these cells kind of shapes. You barely can see it here on the surface, but we can change this a bit. First of all, let's decrease the noise size down here to 0.1 in my case. So, but you can see now it's inverted somehow. I want to have those little bumps. And for this, we just go over to the modifier settings and set this value to negative 0.03. And now you can see, now we have this bumpy surface, and that's it already. Super easy and a quick way to add this scale-like skin to a dragon or this Hydra. And yeah, with the scale value, you certainly can adjust this, how strong this should be. Super easy. So in a moment we go on with the higher detail sculpting of the heads. But here was one thing, since I already duplicated 3 heads here and they are all linked to each other, I had a small problem. Every time in Sculpt Mode with dynamic topology on, every time I made a stroke, it was stopping after each stroke. And I was sculpting this creature here on my older computer, and there I had to wait like 1 or 2 seconds after each stroke, and this was just a pain to sculpt. So, and then I realized the problem was after each stroke, it updates it on the other duplicates. And since this is a polygon heavy object, this takes a while. But yeah, I don't want it to delete the two heads and later on place them again. I used a simple trick. I added a cube here, select the upper heads and the jawbones of the two background heads, and then as last object, I select with Shift the cube here, press Ctrl L, and make links to object data. It's the same thing what I showed you with the scales before, but now I link these heads here to this cube. That means we basically store the position, rotation, and scaling of the two heads, but we don't use the mesh information from this head. That means now I can easily sculpt on this, also with dynamic topology on, and you can see this again works super smooth. And after I was done with adding all the details, I simply select the two upper heads, then this one here again, Ctrl L, object data, and then the two jawbones, this one here as last, Ctrl L, object data. And now you can see it's back normal, and these objects here are also using the details from the head back here. So yeah, here you can see I used the trick I showed you before, and from now on it's basically just sculpting all the high details on the head and on the body. So there's nothing that much to talk about. So I will be quiet and you can enjoy the process. So here I have to quickly interrupt you because you can see I somehow used a way to sculpt these bumps on the surface without using a texture. And yeah, let's quickly take a look on how this works. We switch over to Sculpt Mode, use the standard Sculpt Draw brush. I also enable dynamic topology, and now go to Stroke and increase the jittering. And now if I'm drawing here, you can see it will randomly position the dots around my cursor. And this easy I was able to create this bumpy surface. The larger the value here is, the wider these dots will be spread, and you can also increase the spacing a bit so it will be fewer dots over here. This certainly works with other brushes as well. So yeah, here we go on, we're sculpting these bumps on the body and some of those creases. I also add some wrinkles here to show that this is really bending and there's some energy behind this. I think this really sells it. And then this looks even more like skin from a snake kind of creature. But yeah, I kept the details relatively simple because, as shown before, I added the Displace Modifier to add these kind of scales all over the body. Down here I also added these wrinkles, which really shows that this is lying on the ground, so it's interacting with the ground. Here, as you can see, I added some details to this tip of the tail, and this was one part I cut off, so I only had to add some details over there because the rest you can't see in camera, so why should I care? Yeah, now I copy paste some scales to the tip of the tail here, and I also copied all the scales from the main head to the other two heads in the background, but since this is just copying and pasting, we will skip that part. So there's one thing a roaring monster shouldn't miss, it's a saliva. For this I simply added a plane, added a solidify modifier and a subsurf modifier, and then I just extruded the plane in one dimension basically, and this easy I could create the saliva. And yeah, as you can see, I just duplicated this around, also added some single planes, and yeah, it was that easy actually. And I think this is one little detail which really shows that this is an evil monster roaring in our faces. Yeah, actually after I published this image online, I got some feedback on how to improve this. And one thing here was that I could add some more details to the teeth. So I went into Sculpt Mode and just added some broken parts there. I added some creases and scratches. And I think this really helps to add this little tiny details, especially to the head in the foreground. Also the skin area here, I added some creases to just increase the detail level, and this little damaged area here also really sells it because it's non-symmetrical, and this is really important to add this non-symmetrical elements. Yeah, and that's basically with the modeling process. Now let's take a look on how I created the scene setup and the materials. So first of all, let's take a look at the scene setup. So this is how the whole thing looks like. Pretty simple actually. We have our Hydra in the center, then a simple ground plane here with some displacement modifiers on there. Pretty simple stuff. Also a subsurf modifier for adding a little bit more geometry. Then this big cube here is a cube with a volumetric material on. I show you the material in a second. This is what this looks rendered. It's a cube full of mist basically. And we have one big area light here with orange color and pretty strong. And for the background we are using a HDRI map from hdrihaven.com. By the way, there you can download 100% free and extremely high resolution HDRIs. Definitely a recommendation. So let's quickly show this in the background. You can see actually our Hydra here is in a garage. Cool, huh? So, and this background image is lighting up our scene as well. So these two things are the only lamps I added to my scene. This area lamp here is for the rim light, so that we have a nice sharp light on the edges here. So the creature is a bit more separating from the background, which is pretty good. And the HDRI is lighting up our whole scene a bit. Then on our camera, I enabled limits, so that we have this line here. And then with the distance value, I can control this yellow cross here, which defines the focus point in our image. And with the aperture size here, I can control how strong the depth of field should be. So I just disabled the volumetric cube here so that we can render this a bit faster. And as you can see, the background is out of focus, and the foreground, the creature where the yellow cross was, there everything is super sharp. And this way we can control the focus of our image a bit, so we easily can lead the viewer's eye to the point of interest in our scene. So that's certainly the main head in the foreground here. So then I enabled Filmic Blender under color management. I switched to Filmic, base contrast. There are some tutorials online if you want to know more about that. And that's about it with the scene setup. After I was rendering this, I put it into Photoshop and did some adjustment there. This I show you after the material part. So let's take a look at the materials. They are pretty simple. Actually, back then the principal shader was not included in Blender, so I did some hacking over there to get something like a PBR shader, but for this file here I replaced this with a principal shader, and then the whole setup up here is much simpler. So what I basically have are 4 inputs here, one for the color, one for the subsurface scattering color, one for the roughness, and one for the bump/normal map. So let's take a look how this skin scales shader looks like. So if I zoom in here, that's how it looks like, and it's super simple. So first of all, let's take a look at the color map / subsurface scattering color map. I only use procedural textures here, so no external image was loaded into Blender. And I started here with a noise texture and use the texture coordinate object output to project this onto the model, so we have an even scaled texture there. Then I used a color ramp to make a grayscale image out of this, and this I used as a mix factor for a mix shader. That means these two colors will be displayed on black and white, as you can see. I just color the black and the white areas basically. Then up here I use a second noise map, but with a much higher size value, so we have these very little dots here. Same thing, I colored them in black and white, and here with add I mix this color with these little black dots, and then we have this output here. Up here I use the geometry node pointiness output into a color ramp, and this basically detects sharp edges and areas, and with the color ramp we can color them in black. So this setup here depends on the geometry. That means we can see these wrinkles and so on pretty good. So we have something like an ambient occlusion map or cavity map. This again I mix together with the color map, and then we have this thing here, and that's it with the color already. Super simple, but super effective. This, as mentioned, I used for the base color and for the subsurface scattering color. So then let's take a look at the bump map. As you can see, I used a noise texture, again for the small dots, colored this in black and white. And here important, I used the Voronoi texture, similar to the thing we used for the displacement modifier. And then with the color ramp, I inverted this. So we have this kind of spheres here. And then I mixed those two things together with mix node and multiply. And this I put into a bump node as height value. And then you can see we have this little bumps here on the surface. This I connect with a normal input, and then we have this little bumps, and this is the effect which looks like we have scales all over the body. And as you can see, it's super simple. And the last thing I did, I basically just mixed the bump map and the color map together, colored this in black and white, and used this as roughness input so that the reflection is in some areas rougher than in other areas. Yeah, and that is a basic setup, pretty simple as you can see. So then we have the tongue here. As you can see, even simpler. When I zoom in pretty close, you can see again I used a Voronoi texture as bump map, and also this I used as basis. I put this into a color ramp, colored this in two colors basically, and use this as color input, subsurface scattering color, and with this color ramp I created the roughness map, and that's it. For the distance view, this is more than enough. This I also used for the skin area here, and then for the upper head and the jawbone, I basically mixed the scales material with the tongue material with a vertex color map. So let's take a look how this works. Basically, you switch over to vertex painting, and then you have your brushes here, and if you choose white, then you can go down here to paint and click on set vertex color or press Shift K, then everything will be colored in white. And then with black color I just painted the areas which should be this pinkish skin material we used for the tongue. And then there will be a new vertex color slot created called Col. And if you go to input attribute and type in Col, Blender uses this vertex color information. And if we take a look at this, it's basically this black and white image. And then here with the mix shader, I use this as FEC import. That means on the black areas we have this tongue material, and on the white areas we have this scales material. And this easy, we can mix two materials together. I just selected all the nodes from the other materials, Control C, and then here Control V to paste them. And this easy, I copied all the nodes from the other materials to this one. For the saliva, I simply used a super simple glass shader and nothing special there. Also, the eye shader is super simple. As mentioned in my Viking sculpting tutorial, I show in detail how to create these eyes. Yeah, the ground material is also pretty simple, just a mixture of different noise textures. Basically nearly the same as we used for the scales here, just color this a bit different in brown colors. And yeah, that's about it. Then let's take a look at the mist material. Also nothing special, just a volume scatter shader connected with the volume input of the material output node. That's important. Pretty low density and relatively high anisotropy. And the cool thing about this procedural shaders is that you now can place them on all the objects. So the whole body and all the skins and so on are using the exact same material. So I just put the material on all the objects and here we go. So yeah, after I put the whole thing together, I rendered this out and I did a second render where I basically disabled the background, the environment map here for the lighting, and also turned down the strength of the area lamp and colored this in a light blue. And as you can see now, we basically have a black image with only this rim light. And this I rendered out as second image, and then I combined those two in Photoshop to have a stronger rim light here on the edges. So let's take a look how this looks in Photoshop. So this is the final image. As you can see, I did not use that many layers here. So let's take a look. This is basically my raw rendering. As you can see, not much contrast in there. And then I put a camera raw filter on this. You can find this up here under filter, camera raw. And I like this filter because there you have a lot of options for adjusting the contrast, highlights, shadows and stuff like this. So this is basically what I adjusted here. And also the colors I adjusted a bit, saturation, luminance and stuff like this. And then I added the second image here. You can see this is the second image I rendered out with the rim lights here. I set the blend mode to color dodge and played around with the opacity. Then I also colored this. I don't want it to have this blue color. I just want to have this a little bit more orange. So with a hue saturation adjustment layer, I adjusted the hue a bit to a more orange tone. You find this down here. And the final thing I did, because now the whole image was too orange for my taste, I added two color lookups. The first one was horror blue. You find them also down here. Just click on color lookup. Then you can choose between different looks basically. So I chose horror blue and turn down the opacity a bit. And the second one I added was again a color lookup, and in this case the foggy night. And then I also adjusted the opacity a bit. Yeah, and that's it with the post-processing. So I just wanted to adjust the brightness, contrast and color of the image, so I didn't edit any effects here. So now let's take a look how this looks in Blender 2.8 EEVEE and take a look at this. EEVEE is a real-time viewport for Blender 2.8. You already can download this on the official website on blender.org, but it's in early alpha. That means it's absolutely not stable and it might not work on every computer because it's really hardware heavy. I hope and I think this year there will be the first beta version which should run a bit more stable. But anyway, you can test it out, but don't use it for serious projects. So here I created everything in Blender 2.78/9 and just open the scene here in Blender EEVEE. By the way, if you want to learn more about EEVEE and all the settings, just take a look at my video about EEVEE, link in the video description. Yeah, and the cool thing is I just opened the file and most of the things just worked because EEVEE and Cycles are connected to each other. That means everything you set up in EEVEE or Cycles will also work in the other engine. So we also have the cube with the volumetric here. We have the area lamp. We also have the HDRI in the background, but yeah, I disabled this because this looks much cooler. I added one other area lamp to the front here. As you can see, can move it around if I like. Then under the render settings, I enabled some cool effects like the bloom effect, the glow effect, depth of field for the focus here, then volumetrics, ambient occlusion for some additional shadows, subsurface scattering, which you can see on the tongue here pretty well, and also screen space reflections for realistic reflections. And as you can see, we even have refraction here in EEVEE. This looks so cool. And it's just super fun to view this from different angles, and you don't have to wait for the rendering. And yeah, definitely try it out. But as mentioned, it might not work that stable on your computer. And if you want to know how to render an animation out of EEVEE, then also check my other video. There I show how this works. Yeah, I think I can look at this forever, but it's time to finish the video. Alright guys, don't forget to download my free sculpting cheat sheet, link in the video description. And if you want to learn sculpting, check out my Mastering Sculpting workshop. The link is also in the video description. And one final thing, if you need a friendly kick in the butt to keep making awesome art, check out my weekly CG challenge where you can create awesome artwork, get in touch with other artists and win great prizes. Just click here for more info or check the video description. Yeah guys, let me know in the comments below if you like this style mixture of time-lapse and tutorial. Don't forget to like this video if you like, subscribe to this channel, and I bet you can't click on the bell under this video. Or can you? Anyway, thanks for watching guys. See you in the next video. Goodbye. Sorry, I couldn't resist.